I love the PlayStation Vita. Don't get me wrong, the handheld console has always had its flaws. It started strong when it launched back in early 2012, with a substantial game library hitting within the first couple years, only for Sony to basically forget the Vita existed all the way until it was discontinued in 2019. And it's a shame because this little device boasts an amazing amount of power for its time, and there was always so much potential for the hardware. I myself bought the PS Vita Slim model back in 2014 and always felt very screwed over when practically no more games I was interested in would ever launch after this point, but thankfully, the indie community did thrive, and beyond that, the Vita has one of the absolute best homebrew scenes I can think of for any console ever. And it makes sense, because the Vita has almost the perfect form factor for a handheld gaming system. The fact that Sony gave up so fast on what could have ended up outshining the PlayStation Portable, the PSP, had they put in the effort, it's a real shame, and frankly, a modern tragedy for the video game industry. Nowadays, we have the Switch, and even the PlayStation Portal if you're interested in purely streaming your games, but the Vita is still something special, and it manages to maintain far more relevance 13 years later than you would probably expect. Ultimately, there is one thing we know for sure. The PS Vita didn't fail Sony, Sony failed the PS Vita. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today I thought it would be a good time to look at one of my favorite all-time gaming consoles and see how it holds up all these years later, and if it could even still be worth buying. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the Vita's hardware, I wanted to take some time to specifically talk about the Vita's standing nearly a decade and a half since its launch. First thing you'll notice if you want one for yourself is the pricing. If anything, it seems like the Vita has only gotten more expensive over the years, although on eBay I was finding some fairly reasonable listings that typically hovered at $100 to $150. You'll find the vast majority of Vitas tend to be sold from Japan. There is no region locking though, so you should be able to use the system no problem wherever you live. But even with that, do I recommend buying a Vita anymore? Well, probably not, especially if you already have something like a Nintendo Switch. What hurts the Vita more than anything else at this point is just the fact that it's old. While the PlayStation Store absolutely still works, a lot of games have been delisted over the years, and who knows how long Sony will keep it up for. You could of course find other ways of getting games, like physical cartridges or even sailing the 7 seas, but you didn't hear that from me. When it comes to the actual games themselves, we've obviously not seen new content in a long time, and the vast majority of big, like AAA titles that remain came out within the first couple years of the Vita's existence. So if you're not into indie games or Japanese titles, you're probably not going to find too much appealing from the Vita, aside from potentially homebrewing and emulation, which is a lot of fun and opens up a lot of options. Like, just look at this, I'm running the PSP's actual software and can play PSP games through it. It's awesome, no other way to put it. And you do have essentially the entire library of the PSP and PS1 at your disposal with this machine, as well as many other systems that can be emulated, including some from the company that must not be named. This is for educational purposes only, please Nintendo do not sue me. If you already have a Vita though, or just got one, there's definitely a lot you can do with it. Just remember, it is old, it has limitations, and it has flaws even when it originally launched. Sony tried a bit too hard to cram a bunch of smartphone features in here, some of which are harmless or even nice to have like the cameras, and some were just flops like the 3G model of the Vita that was only sold for about a year. This is an amazing console for modding and playing around with, but it's not going to compete with the game library and general experience of a Nintendo Switch. Still, I do love the Vita, and a lot of other people do too, so I believe it's worth discussion. Throughout the Vita's lifespan, we would basically see 3 iterations of the console. The original is known as the OLED model for its display, with the slim model coming later within a few years. It used an LCD screen, which is less vibrant, but it was able of course to slim down the form factor and increase battery life, which is why I chose it over the original personally, being not so aware of the differences between OLED and LCD at the time. I've got no regrets, and in hindsight the Slim is more accessible anyways, thanks to having a standard micro USB port rather than the odd dedicated port on that original Vita. Vita. If you were to purchase a Vita today and are wondering which model is best, I don't really have a dog in the fight, they're both great and have pros and cons, so I'd probably lean towards whatever seems like the best deal. Sony actually using an OLED screen in the early 2010s was pretty impressive, and while there are potential issues like burn-in that can crop up, these are often still highly desired models, though the Slim is as well, and again on eBay, these things are going to cost you at least $100. There's absolutely a demand for a system like this, and it's just a shame Sony didn't see that before it was too late. As for the third version of the Vita, I didn't forget, we have the PlayStation TV, which was essentially the Vita hardware crammed into a little box that could hook up to your TV, removing any portable aspect of the system. I always thought this was an interesting idea, but one poorly executed. There's too many games that out of the box aren't functional on this system due to not having touchscreen controls. Still, it was kinda cool, and with some homebrewing, there's a lot of potential for fun here as well. The PS Vita, as far as mobile consoles go, still holds up a lot better than you would probably expect, even compared to something like a Nintendo Switch. The 5-inch display, whether OLED or LCD, has a resolution of 960 by 544 for a pixel density of 220 pixels per inch. This was on par with smartphones of the era, which were a large influence on how the Vita was made from the get-go. While this resolution might sound low relative to phones today, on a 5-inch screen it looks absolutely fine. In fact, the OLED Switch actually has a slightly lower pixel density at 210 pixels per inch, meaning the Vita is slightly sharper, believe it or not. This means there are games that can look absolutely great, and while blowing them up onto the big screen with, say, a PlayStation TV wouldn't look so hot, on the small screen it's just about perfect. And everything about the physical form factor of this console feels just about perfect, although there are a few minor nitpicks I still have even to this day. Let's start with the good. We have two joysticks on either side of the screen, which in and of itself is huge considering the PSP only had one, and the 3DS only had one as well, until they brought that little nub on the later 3DS models, but I mean, can you really even count that? But these were full-blown joysticks, though they didn't click in like a normal controller. You've then got your D-pad on the left and main buttons on the right, and they feel great. They're the perfect level of squishy and tactile, allowing for satisfying gameplay. You've also got your PlayStation button on the left that acts like a typical home button, then on the right, both start and select. The speakers are fine, and you do have a headphone jack as well. On the top of the system, we have a bumper on each side, and I think this is where the first issue comes into play. We only have one bumper per side, not two like on a typical PlayStation controller. It's understandable given the need to keep the console slim, but you do need to cram in some extra controls somewhere, and this is where things get a bit weird, because there's really 4 buttons missing here. Some of this functionality could be regained via the touchscreen, but you also had the rear touchpad, which I always found personally very awkward and uncomfortable to use. It does work, but I would rather physical buttons to click over something like this. That was always probably my biggest complaint with the build of the Vita, but odds are most games you play won't even require you to use it anyways, and if they do, it's a rare occurrence. There is also some cool stuff like the gyroscope for motion controls, there's a microphone. As for the cameras, we've got two 0.3 megapixel sensors, one on the front, one on the back, and I would say any novelty of having a camera outweighs the actual practicality of using it. The Vita does not take good photos, nor does it need to, but at least I've forever got this selfie from when I was 15 to remind me of better days. It can take panoramas for some reason, and judging from this one, I'm guessing I took it on some sort of road trip, and I think these were probably pretty hit and miss in quality. On the bottom of the Vita, we've got that micro USB port that is only on the Slim, as well as a slot for memory cards, which we'll revisit shortly. Turning to the top, we've got the power button, volume buttons, some LEDs from the Vita is on or charging, and finally the cartridge slot, which we can pull off this tab thing here to put in a game card of our choice. Obviously, physical media is really nice with a console like this, since you've got limited storage and downloading games will eat into it very quickly. The game cartridges are also thankfully much smaller and more straightforward than the infamous UMDs on the PSP that amount to basically mini DVDs in a plastic case. Those have their charm, but it can be loud for one thing with the spinning discs, and they always just felt weird and clunky to me to even put into the console. Now let's talk about the storage situation. My PS Vita has only about a gig of internal storage. It came on the Slim, so it was practically a requirement to buy a separate memory card, and I've got this 8GB one here. You would hope you could use micro SD, like any Android smartphone or even the Nintendo 3DS or DS from around this time, but no, like with the PSP, Sony just had to have their own proprietary memory card, and so that's what we've got here. And holy moly, did they ever overprice these things to an absurd degree. We're talking $30 for 4 gigs, $45 for 8, $70 for 16, and an insane $120 for a 32GB memory card. That was basically half the price of the console itself, as the Wi-Fi model retailed for $250 when it came out. This was so unnecessary from Sony, just a pathetic way to to squeeze their customers, many of whom may not have realized they would even need a memory card when they bought their console. It's aged worse thanks to SD cards being as cheap as they are now, but this was always ridiculous right from its inception. So if you're using a Vita now, it's basically a requirement to get something like this, an aftermarket game card that can act as a micro SD card adapter. Just stick it in your Vita and bam, you can actually install things now with as much space as you want. Imagine that. Okay, mind you, it's not quite that simple because you need to hack your Vita, homebrew it, and that thankfully is very straightforward and there's really no reason not to, so you absolutely should. I'm not going to go into how to do it. There's tons of guides out there. It just makes your Vita better and also opens up a lot of other options like emulation and some cool stuff like that. And once we've got that and actually turn on and use the Vita, man, I absolutely love this UI. The PSP's UI was great because it was basically just straight ripped from the PS3, and I love that one too, but the Vita's is just so unique and fun and really stands out from the crowd. Even just unlocking the device, you peel back the lock screen with your finger and then bam, you've got these quirky bubble icons that bounce around with every swipe. There were fun themes. I always had the 20th anniversary PlayStation one. Funnily enough, as of making this video, the 30th anniversary is now being marketed by Sony, so yeah, we're all old, but this is still pretty cool. Swiping to the side gives us basically our multitasking, and we can swipe through our open applications and then close them by peeling them just like the lock screen. You can only have one game actively open at a time, but considering how underpowered the Vita is relative to what we have now, the software feels very impressive and smooth to navigate through. The UI has character and it makes it more memorable. If you look at the Switch UI in comparison, for example, while that's great and it's very functional, it's also very boring, which can be a good thing, but you won't see many people in 10-20 years feel nostalgia towards the Switch's UI, but the Vita's? Absolutely, because it stands out, and I think that's worth something. Just like the Wii's UI from back in the day, everyone remembers that because it's memorable. In terms of the software functionality and feature set built into the console, it's here where we see some examples of Sony leaning too far into the smartphone angle with the Vita. Not always for the worse, of course. There were some more smartphone-like apps that were downloadable from the PlayStation Store, such as YouTube, for the short time it was actually available. It does not work anymore, giving an error, and there's a note saying it was delisted and wouldn't be supported past April 2015. Yeah, 3 years after this console came out, Google pulled YouTube app support. Pretty dang rough and indicative of the general feelings surrounding the Vita at the time. Reality is, everyone by 2015 had smartphones, and the Vita already had much older, slower hardware than those phones, so there was very little reason not to just use your phone or computer for YouTube and the like. And I guess Google saw there was very little usage and they cut support. There is a web browser, of course, and it's slow but still technically functional. I'd equate it to using an Android phone from 2011 or 2012 today. It's a bit excruciating, but it does technically work. The digital keyboard is also a little awkward to use given how you hold the Vita, but it's actually not too bad. But this isn't exciting. We all know what a crappy web browser is capable of. Let's take a look at the built-in apps, starting with Welcome Park, which was meant to help you try out the exciting features on your Vita system. Sony's words, not mine. This is a collection of simple mini games meant to get you to try some of those gimmicks of the Vita, and honestly, I can say I do not recall ever doing any of these. Surely I must have, right? Like, I must have tried this at some point when I was bored on a car trip or something, but I can't remember it at all. Not gonna complain about a little free extra content though, because why not? We've got apps for PSN stuff, there's a parental control app, some media apps, including the camera, a calendar, and even an email manager, which seems a bit unnecessary, but sure. And then there's also the Near app, which was pretty odd. It was supposed to let you see nearby players within a 10-mile radius and share info on what you've been playing and so on. It's one of those ideas that may have been a bit more successful if the Vita was ever more popular. But to finish off the built-in apps, we've got two of note: PS3 Remote Play and PS4 Link. The PS3 Remote Play was super limited and only worked with a few games. There was actually a lawsuit over this, with the FTC calling out Sony for misleading customers. The PS4 Link, though, was a lot more robust, offering genuinely functional remote play, or it could act as a second screen for a few games, like I think it could be the map for Assassin's Creed Black Flag, but it was an extremely underutilized feature. Remote Play, though, was pretty cool, allowing you to play your PS4 games on your Vita with a strong Wi-Fi connection. Back when I was a kid, lived at home, there's only one TV to share with the family, this actually had its uses here and there, and with a more basic game, it was a pretty good experience. Nowadays, there's plenty of options for remote playing your PS5, and you can thank the Vita for helping to pave the groundwork. But as cool as that was, and as cool as a lot of the Vita is, what really matters at the end of the day is games. Without games, this console is nothing. Without games, it was always going to be doomed to failure. It's no secret that the Vita is most known now for Japanese titles and plenty of indie games, which has led to its cult following, but the reality is, Sony needed big AAA games to draw in the real numbers, at least in the West. To say Sony set up the PS Vita to fail is an understatement, but it wasn't always that way. The first couple years saw an extremely impressive game lineup for any portable system, with a plethora of nearly home console level titles that really set the Vita apart from its competition in the Nintendo 3DS. On 3DS, you weren't going to have graphics of this quality, and you probably weren't going to have too many mature-oriented games like Killzone Mercenary and the like. The Vita was set to take on the teenage and adult portable handheld market, something Sony probably should have leaned into from the get-go, even just considering the success of Sega's ad campaigns in the 90s, fostering the Genesis as a more grown-up system. I myself was 13 or 14 when I bought my Vita, whereas my 10 or 11-year-old brother had just gotten a 3DS. I was, at the time, the perfect mark for a console like this, at an age where I was ready to move on from my Nintendo DSi XL to something more grown-up, if you will. Now mind you, while I was interested in some of the more mature games like Killzone, which was fun, the main game I wanted was the Sly Cooper collection that ported the PS2 trilogy onto the handheld. These games were my childhood, and even a decade ago I was always a nostalgic, though I maintain that these games have held up pretty well in my eyes. The big takeaway here though was that I was able to play some of my favorite PS2 games on the go, and that trend did apply to other big PS2 series as well. We saw classics like Ratchet & Clank, God of War, Metal Gear Solid, Jak and Daxter, and so on. Now the quality of these ports varied, and I've seen some very mixed reviews, but the potential was absolutely there to make this almost a portable PlayStation 2 with a little effort. And yet, like everything else with Sony and the Vita, the vast majority of these collections popped up over the first few years, and then that was sort of it. The crazy thing is that a lot of the games the PS Vita did get were often pretty high quality, with probably the consensus best of all time being the very big JRPG Persona 4 Golden. This took the PS2 version of Persona 4, added some content, and packaged it for the Vita exclusively. It was easily the best way to experience Persona 4 for years until it was finally ported to PC in 2020, and now every modern console as well. This is a game I didn't play until I was a little bit older, but I have played through a good chunk of it on my Vita, and it's a really fun experience. To have an 80-hour behemoth of a title like this on a portable system shows exactly why the Vita could be so great. The graphics may not be anything special, but this was a full-fledged PS2 game. You weren't going to see something like this on the 3DS. There weren't too many other big-name exclusives. Tearaway was a big one, as was Gravity Rush, and I'm sure there's some more, but again, these aren't the titles that can sufficiently sell a system. You need your Call of Duties, your Uncharted's, your Assassin's Creed, Killzone, Need for Speed, Borderlands 2, and yet these were once again all part of that initial game lineup within the first couple of years. I'm personally a very dedicated hockey fan and don't care much for football, and yet I've got Madden 13 for my Vita because there were so few games for the system, I just didn't know what else to get for it, and it was actually kind of fun. But really, I played a crap ton of the Sly Cooper remasters, as well as the fourth game, which I wasn't a huge fan of. I also played a good bit of Need for Speed Most Wanted, and honestly not a whole lot beyond those games. It all comes back to that one thing I think is too easy to overlook with the Vita, the pure, unbridled potential of this console. Now sure, that's easy to say in hindsight when it's developed a close-knit community and has become a bit of a cult classic console, but we know there's real potential here because of the Nintendo Switch, a portable home console you could bring anywhere, and while I don't think the Vita should have been that, it's the idea of having these really high-quality home console level titles on the go that has a much wider appeal than I think Sony realized back in 2011, especially when smartphones were threatening to eat into the portable gaming space. If we're being honest, it makes sense smartphones would scare Sony, and it's why so many features we associate with phones were brought to the Vita to almost compete with them in a certain sense. Sony even had their Xperia Play come out around the same time as the Vita as sort of an Android competitor in a weird way, and that thing failed even harder than the Vita due to Sony's poor support for it, so yeah, big surprise, right? Mobile gaming in its infancy seemed like it had all the room in the world to become a behemoth myth, overpowering the rest of the gaming industry. And it kind of did, but it turns out that it was more simplistic games like Candy Crush or Clash of Clans that were the best experience on a phone. Or maybe Jetpack Joyride, which did find its way to the Vita, funnily enough, and I'll admit, I actually did play a good bit of that back in the day. But when it came to more complex titles that require precise control, smartphones just aren't the ideal platform. While today you might have some games like Death Stranding on the App Store, you're not gonna really have a great time with that if you're using touch controls. And yeah, you can bring out a controller or some sort of accessory to help with that, but it starts to defeat the purpose of portability. Having a device like the Switch or even the Vita that is purely made for gaming and does it well, the demand for this was never gonna go away. And at this point, I think it's probably stronger than ever. Sony just didn't see that, and they gave up too quickly. Before we wrap this up, we do need to at least mention the closest thing to a successor for the Vita, the PlayStation Portal, which is essentially a tablet with two halves of a PS5 controller stuck on the sides, and it streams your PS5, just like the Vita remote played your PS4. You do already need to have a PS5, which limits the market potential, and you also always need to have an internet connection. At least for me, this really starts to defeat the purpose of having a portable system in the first place. I mean, on the Vita, yeah, you could remote play your PS4, but there was also a bunch of games for the Vita that you could play without internet. I get it, there are certainly scenarios where a portal would be cool to have, but when it comes to long car rides or plane travel or even just a place with spotty internet, this isn't gonna work, at least not consistently. The portal feels like such a wasted opportunity by Sony and a bit of a spit in the face for those who had held out hope they would bring back the Vita or PSP in some form eventually. Now that's not to criticize anyone who might have bought the portal and like it, don't get me wrong, it looks really sleek, nice, I've heard it's a good experience. I fully understand the portal would be awesome in the right situation. And again, the PS Vita, it had some pretty cool streaming options for the PS4. I remember playing Destiny, the first one, on my Vita this way, just for the novelty alone, and it didn't work great, but smartphones can also stream your PS5 now. There weren't so many options when the Vita was around for remote play, but at this point, you can use almost anything to remote play your PS5. You don't need the portal. While the PlayStation Portal might fit a specific niche perfectly, it's just not the same as having a dedicated handheld with its own cartridges that plays its own games with or without internet. Plus, the Vita is small and it fits in your pocket. You can bring it around so much easier than even like a Switch Lite. Sony was on to something special with the Vita, but they gave up too soon. Again, the PS Vita didn't fail Sony, Sony failed the PS Vita, and while the system has always had its flaws, there's a reason there's still an active community and robust homebrewing scene. There will never ever be another console quite like the Vita, a blend between the PlayStation Portable and smartphones, something that only could have been made in the early 2010s. I love my Vita and still play it once in a while, and I don't see that changing, at least anytime soon. And so with that, I think I'm right about done here. The PS Vita holds up about as well as you could hope for any video game console from 2011, and its life and legacy continues on through the dedicated online community surrounding it. These aren't exactly the cheapest on eBay these days, but if you ever get a chance to pick up a Vita and play it for yourself all these years later, I'd say go for it. If anything, it's fun. And what more can you ask from a handheld console? If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more tech content just like this. Any of you still have the PS Vita? Do you play it anymore? Make sure you leave a comment down below, very curious on this one. Huge shout out to the channel members for being amazing people, thank you guys so much, and thank you all so much for watching. I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.